Hey, beautiful friends. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. And honestly, it's really special and dear to my heart. So let's go ahead and dive in. If you have ever felt like life didn't turn out the way that you thought it would, or that there's some part of your story that's unfinished, you're not alone. And I have felt that too. A lot of us have felt that, especially when we get to midlife, we kind of assess things that we've done in our past. We're looking at what we want to do in the future. And sometimes we sit with regret and grief. But what if I told you it's not too late, right? Like there's still something that you can build that's beautiful, even if the beginning was messy or full of loss or chaos. Today, I'm going to be sharing the story of someone who taught me all of that firsthand, my great Aunt Bernice. And she didn't live a picture perfect life by any means, but she did live a long, beautiful life until the age of 94. And so by the end of this episode, I hope that you'll walk away with a fresh sense of purpose, joy, and a little reminder that it's still possible to make life beautiful again. Have you ever had one of those quiet thoughts like, this really isn't how I thought life was going to turn out? Yeah, me too. So for a long time, I didn't even realize where that feeling was coming from. But now I'm able to look back and kind of see where a lot of that started. And a lot of it started with my mom's story. She lost her mother when she was just 4 years old to a very tragic and in a very heartbreaking way. And because of what ended up happening that same day, she was taken in by other family members and she never went back home and she never was able to even get to know her father very well. And while she never really talked about it, I know that that pain did shape her life. But what's really neat to say about my mom, she learned how to survive, but she also learned how to thrive. And she became very strong, I believe, beginning with that moment at the age of 4. And so that strength, now I'm able to see that that actually runs in our family. And you'll see when I talk a little bit about my great Aunt Bernice. But just to finish out that story, I did get to know my grandfather a little bit growing up, just on holidays. I remembered he'd make me recite Psalm 23 by memory every year. So I always practiced before we arrived. And then he always gave me a pack of juicy fruit gum and slipped me a $20 bill. So that was the extent of our relationship, but I still get sentimental when I'm in the checkout line at the grocery store and I see juicy fruit, right? But the reality is we didn't really get to know him. And so my mom really never got to know her dad or her mother. And so that's the important part of this story. Because of all of that, a whole side of our family just kind of faded from our lives, or for me, never existed. And we didn't know them. And so what's really neat is the Lord arranged a way for us decades later, during COVID, actually, to finally meet my great Aunt Bernice. And yet, the moment we met, what was really funny is it felt like inside of us was actually waking up. Like we had found a part of our story that had been completely missing for a very long time. And for us, she was kind of like the grandmother I never got to meet because she filled in the gap and explained things and talked about my grandmother that I had never met. So I actually felt like I got to meet her. And for her, what's really neat is I'm going to get emotional. You know, she wasn't able to have kids. And so I believe that we got to fill in a very special place of her heart that felt like was missing too. So, um, that connection, it didn't just surprise us, it actually healed us. And so that is what I'm sharing, why I'm sharing this today, because if you have felt that too, maybe your story has gaps. Maybe things are completely missing. Maybe you don't even know that they're missing until that missing piece shows up. But maybe life just isn't what you'd hoped it would look like. And so here's what I want you to know: beauty can still find you. Okay. It might come late or feel like it's late, but God's timing is always perfect, right? And it actually might come through in a very unexpected manner, but it still comes. And so that's what I want to show you today. So here's something I think doesn't actually get talked about often enough. The grief that we carry, not just necessarily from losing someone, which grief definitely comes in that form, but a lot of women in our midlife, we feel this sense of grief from a lost dream. But, maybe your family doesn't look anything like you hoped it would, or maybe the career that you had been chasing down forever never really materialized. Maybe the version of your life that you thought you'd be living by your mid 40s just didn't unfold that way. And that kind of grief is like a quiet grief, right? And you don't always cry about it because you don't necessarily know. And if you're anything like me, you have trained yourself to push those emotions to the back, but you feel it when you see someone else living what you hoped for. You feel it in those still quiet moments. And it might be in the holidays. And that's why my great Aunt Bernice's life impacted me so deeply in those short years that we got to be with her. She didn't get the story that she imagined either. She and her husband, they couldn't have children. And I know that that wasn't the plan, because if you ever got to meet her, you know how much she loves kids. But instead of closing off her heart, and this is a very key part, but instead of closing off her heart, she opened it wider in the middle of her grief. So she ended up fostering dozens and dozens of foster kids. And, you know, it was really cool because not only did she foster a lot of kids, she ended up working in a cafeteria at the school so that she could stay in touch with a lot of those kids. And she not only just stayed in touch with a lot of those kids, anything that she had been participating in, she continued to pour out her heart to them everywhere she went. She's the kind of person, the little old lady who is smiling at you in the grocery store, right? But I'll never forget when we finally got to meet her after all of those years. She smiled and she said, I may not have had my own children, but I had plenty of children. And so if you have had that type of loss, I want you to tune in, because she just will teach you ways to experience that fulfillment that you have been missing out on. And it was true. She learned how to make her life beautiful. Not because it all went according to plan, because that is not what typically happens, but because she chose. She chose connection. She chose purpose. She chose joy anyway. And I want you to know, so can you. You're not too old and you're not too late. Your story may not have followed the script, but there's still time to create something meaningful and beautiful, not in spite of the grief that you've carried, but because of what that grief has taught you. There's beauty just waiting to be built right in the middle of what you thought was broken. Right? There's a masterpiece there to be built. So I promised you some of her secrets to living a long and beautiful life. So let me go ahead and tell you a little bit more about my Aunt Bernice, and how she chose to live her life after life didn't go the way she had planned. Like I said, she didn't have children. She did end up losing her husband, and yet she didn't close off her heart. And she ended up, after all of that, she traveled, she went on missions trips, she traced her roots all the way back to Scotland and Ireland and went to those countries just so that she could see what life was like for them. And then she chose to go to Israel so she could walk where Jesus walked. She chose to show up for her life, and she kept giving herself to it day by day. And so not once did she treat herself like she was done. But really gets me is the way she lived in balance. She took care of her body. It was a sacred responsibility. She knew what stewardship meant. She walked daily, ate clean, stayed strong. Here's what's funny. Even after a stroke, she was placed in a nursing home. And the doctor had prescribed her exercise, but this was during COVID. So they had quarantined her and locked her in her bedroom, even though she didn't have COVID. And so it really, really upset her. So she snuck out at night out of her room just so that she could walk the hallways and walk the steps and climb the stairs to get that exercise in because it really mattered to her. So eventually she did end up moving out of that nursing home and lived on her own again. I mean, she lived on her own all the way up to the last couple months of her life. But in her words, she said, if I've got breath, I've got purpose. I've got a job to do. The Lord has something he wants me to do. And so, yeah, she still made room for those sweet things in life, right? Every single day, she had to have a mini Pepsi. And most of the time, she just needed a sip, right? That was enough, but not to escape her life or not to have a guilty pleasure or anything like that, but to kind of almost celebrate, because life can be bitter sometimes. She knew that you just need something sweet to remind you that it's still worth savoring and living and enjoying, right? And that little ritual wasn't about the soda, it was about choosing joy. And so, of course, I wouldn't choose Mini Pepsi as my little sweet moment, but all of us have something in our lives that we can tap ourselves into to remind us that life is still sweet and is worth living, right? That grief and gratitude, they worked hand in hand. And she knew how that worked, right? It was like she knew that discipline and delight can live in the same house. And so here's the part I want you to hear. Bernice didn't just live long, she lived well. She knew how important it was for the quality of life. And so she was strong, she was healthy, and she was sharp as a whip into her 90s. It's so wild. In the last couple months of her life, she was not able to do this, but she still was a greeter at her church all the way up to the end. And she also cleaned houses for the shut-ins at her church. The people that were younger than her, she at 93, 94 was cleaning their houses. So you have a story to tell and a legacy to leave behind, just like she did. And her greatest legacy was that she loved Jesus and everything she did was unto the Lord, right? She loved people. She lived in that way that says, my life just isn't mine. It's a gift to be given away. And so, friend, if she could do that with the hand that she was dealt, so can we. And I didn't even get into the rest of the parts of her life, right? I only have a few minutes here, but Bernice's life was such a beautiful reminder that we don't have to wait for everything to be perfect before we start making life beautiful again, right? We can start now. We can start right where we are, right this moment, right now, And so here's my challenge for you this week. Start looking at your life as a gift. And I know that can be complicated if you're in the middle of a really tough situation, but there is something for you to stop and pause and see gratitude in the moment, right? Ask yourself, like, where can I bring a little more balance, a little more sweetness, a little more purpose into this day, right? And so if you're living a really bitter life right now, then just think about what sweetness I can bring in today. But just one small shift like Bernice did. She always just took her daily walk, even when she was sick, or maybe a little mini Pepsi just to have a moment of joy. So that for you could be dancing in your kitchen, swinging on a swing like you were a kid, right? These very little things can be the very thing that ushers in the change that helps you heal from the grief. And hey, if you haven't grabbed the free workbook yet, please make sure that you do. You can go into the Facebook group to download it. It's filled with prompts to help you reflect, to reconnect, and actually apply these truths in your life today. But next week, we're going to go deeper into balance with easy and nourishing ways to feed your body so it can carry you into this long, strong, and beautiful life that you're trying to build. Okay. I'll help you figure out what your body actually needs without all the overwhelm. There's a lot of diets out there and a lot of nutritional advice. And I am certified in this, so it's not just coming from YouTube research. Okay. But until then, I want you to keep showing up for your life, keep savoring those sweet moments, and keep making your life beautiful again. We'll see you next week.